sometimes shake their heads at the memory of that early contempt, that fatal underestimation, that arrogance that comes before the fall, and they would say quietly, with the wisdom that comes too late to matter, that they should have feared the lightning from the very beginning, should have recognized that an aircraft designed with such radical thinking, backed by American industrial might and flown by pilots willing to learn from their mistakes and adapt their tactics, would inevitably become a war winner. But they had laughed instead, had dismissed it as another clumsy American attempt to build fighters, had returned to their airfields confident in their superiority, and that laughter had cost them everything, because while they were laughing, American engineers were improving the Lightning, American pilots were learning to fly it properly, American factories were building them by the thousands, and by the time the laughter stopped, by the time German commanders realized the fork-tailed devil was crushing their best squadrons and there was nothing they could do to stop it, the war in the air was already lost, and the Lightning had proven that unconventional design, properly employed and continuously refined, can overcome initial skepticism and battlefield setbacks to become the very weapon that enemies most feared, teaching a lesson that would echo through military aviation history. Never laugh at your enemy's innovations, because today's ungainly curiosity may become tomorrow's unstoppable weapon, and the price of that arrogance is paid in burning aircraft, destroyed squadrons, and the bitter taste of defeat delivered by the very weapon you once mocked. For more aerial victories than any other American fighter through mid-1944, P-38 pilots claimed nearly 2,600 German aircraft destroyed by war's end, and most significantly, the presence of long-range escorts like the P-38 reduced bomber losses to sustainable levels and allowed the strategic bombing campaign to continue, gradually grinding down German industrial capacity and oil production until the Luftwaffe was starved of fuel and forced to watch helplessly as Allied aircraft dominated the skies over Germany. The final irony came in the last months of the war, when captured German pilots and commanders were interrogated about their experiences and opinions of various Allied aircraft, and repeatedly, with a mixture of respect and regret, they would mention the fork-tailed devil, would describe how its appearance over German airspace signaled the beginning of the end for Luftwaffe superiority, would admit that they had underestimated it badly in those early days when it seemed ungainly and mechanically troubled, would acknowledge that by the time they recognized its true capabilities and developed tactics to counter it, the Americans had too many of them and the pilots flying them had become too skilled, too experienced, too aggressive, and the opportunity to destroy American air power in its infancy had passed. And now in 1945 they were paying the price for that early arrogance, watching as P-38s and their single-engine cousins flew at will over German territory, as bombers, escorted by fork-tailed devils, turned German cities to rubble, as the air force that had once been the terror of Europe was reduced to hiding its few remaining aircraft in tunnels and forests, rationing fuel, sending up inexperienced boys in obsolete aircraft to face veteran American pilots in machines that had evolved far beyond those laughable fork-tailed curiosities of 1942. And in those interrogation rooms, sitting across from Allied intelligence officers, those captured German pilots would range to intercept him over 400 miles of ocean, make the kill, and return safely were P-38s. And so 18 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron launched on what would become one of the most significant air combat missions of the war, flying for hours at wavetop height to avoid detection, navigating by dead reckoning across featureless ocean, their timing so precise that they arrived over Bougainville exactly as Yamamoto's bomber and its escorts appeared, and in the brief, violent engagement that followed, Captain Thomas Lanfear and Lieutenant Rex Barber's P-38s shot down both Japanese bombers, killing Yamamoto and delivering a blow to Japanese morale and strategic planning from which they never fully recovered. And while this mission took place in the Pacific rather than Europe, the news reverberated through Luftwaffe command because it demonstrated capabilities that should have been impossible, that a fighter aircraft could fly 1,000-mile missions with pinpoint timing, engage successfully at the end of that flight and return home, capabilities that no German fighter possessed, and that made the P-38 a strategic weapon rather than just a tactical fighter. The tide had turned completely by late 1944, when P-38s were flying from Italy, England, and France, when German fighter pilots had learned through bitter experience to treat the fork-tailed devil with respect bordering on fear, when Luftwaffe commanders no longer laughed at intelligence reports showing P-38 formations but instead tried to calculate how to counter an aircraft that could escort bombers anywhere, that could outrun most of their fighters in level flight, that could outdive Anything they had that carried enough fuel to loiter over target areas waiting for German interceptors to appear, and that possessed firepower capable of destroying any German aircraft with a 1 or 2 second burst, and the statistics told the story more clearly than any anecdotal evidence. P-38s in Europe accounted. Aircraft, and they would be tumbling earthward trailing smoke and flame, joining the hundreds of other German pilots who had learned too late that the fork-tailed devil was no joke. The names of American P-38 aces began appearing in Luftwaffe intelligence reports with increasing frequency and alarm. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 kills, all scored in P-38s in the Pacific. Thomas Maguire, second highest with 38 kills. Charles McDonald with 27, Gerald Johnson with 22, and dozens of others who racked up impressive scores flying the Lightning. But it wasn't just the aces who made the P-38 feared. It was the average pilot, the squadron workhorses, the men who flew. Mission after mission, protecting bombers, sweeping ahead of strike packages, engaging German fighters on roughly equal terms now that they understood their aircraft's strengths and how to employ them, and the cumulative effect of hundreds of P-38s operating across the European theater was devastating to German air superiority. Because unlike the desperate situation of 1940 to 1942 when the Luftwaffe could concentrate its fighters wherever needed and overwhelm local Allied air presence through numerical superiority and better tactics, now they faced a situation where American fighters, particularly the long-ranged P-38s, could appear anywhere, and German fighters that had once hunted bomber formations with impunity now found themselves being hunted, forced into defensive battles against escorts that were faster, better armed, and increasingly well-flown by pilots who had learned harsh lessons and incorporated them into deadly efficiency. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating blow came on April 18, 1943, when American intelligence intercepted and decoded a message revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, would be flying in a bomber from Rabaul to Bougainville on an inspection tour, and the only aircraft with the plagued earlier versions, increased fuel capacity that extended the already impressive range even further, allowing P-38s to escort bombers deep into Germany and back, something no single-engine fighter could match, and improved gunsight systems that made the already devastating nose armament even more effective. And these improvements transformed the P-38 from a promising but problematic aircraft into a mature, deadly weapons system that could compete with the best fighters the Luftwaffe could field, and more importantly, could do things those German fighters simply couldn't match, particularly in terms of range and firepower. The moment when the laughter in German briefing rooms turned to concern, then fear, then desperate respect, came gradually through 1943 and into 1944 as P-38 squadrons began appearing everywhere across the European theater, flying missions that single-engine fighters couldn't attempt, escorting bomber formations deep into Germany when previously those bombers had been slaughtered by German fighters once they passed beyond the range of their Spitfire and P-47 escorts, and suddenly the strategic bombing campaign that had been bleeding the 8th Air Force white with unsustainable losses began to succeed because the bombers had guardian angels that could stay with them all the way to the target and back. Fork-tailed angels that dove out of the sky with that distinctive roar of twin Allisons and shredded any German fighter that tried to approach the bomber formations, and the Luftwaffe's carefully cultivated cadre of bomber-killer aces found themselves having to fight through layers of P-38s before they could even reach the B-17s, and many of them never made it through, never got their chance to line up on those vulnerable bombers because a P-38 would materialize from above or behind, its concentrated firepower would stitch a line of destruction across their aircraft, and they would be tumbling earthward trailing smoke and flame, joining the Messerschmitts and started using their aircraft's strengths of speed, altitude, and firepower. The kill ratios began to shift dramatically, and suddenly German pilots who had laughed at the fork-tailed devil found themselves on the defensive, scanning the sky above them with growing anxiety because a P-38 could be diving out of the sun at 450 miles per hour before they even knew it was there, its 4.50 calories and 20 millimeters cannon converging their fire into a cone of destruction that didn't require the pilot to calculate convergence because all the weapons fired parallel, meaning that at any range from 100 to 1,000 yards, if the target was in the Pipper, the shells were going to hit, and German aircraft began falling from the sky in increasing numbers, their pilots often never seeing what killed them, just a sudden hammering of impacts, the horrifying sound of metal tearing, the acrid smell of smoke filling the cockpit, and then fire, always the fire, because the lightning's concentrated. Firepower could reduce an aircraft to burning wreckage in a 2-second burst. The technical improvements came rapidly as well, Because unlike Germany, whose industrial capacity was increasingly stretched and whose ability to implement major design changes was hampered by the demands of maintaining current production, American factories had the resources and flexibility to continuously upgrade the Lightning, and so the P-38J model that began reaching operational squadrons in mid-1943 incorporated lessons learned from thousands of combat hours, revised intercoolers that improved high-altitude performance, better cockpit heating that kept pilots comfortable at 30,000 feet, electrically heated flight suits that eliminated the frostbite problem, dive flaps under the wings that allowed pilots to make high-speed dives without encountering compressibility issues, giving them an escape option that earlier models lacked, more reliable turbo superchargers that reduced the engine failures that had. Lightning's higher wing loading put it at a disadvantage, and suffering from the mechanical problems that continued to plague the early production models. And so Luftwaffe aces racked up kills against these fork-tailed Americans with the same efficiency they demonstrated against other Allied aircraft, and the contemptuous nickname Der Gabelschwanz-Teufel was spoken with laughter in German mess halls, and intelligence officers reported back to high command that the American twin-engine fighter posed no serious threat to German air superiority, that it was heavy and unmaneuverable, that it suffered from engine reliability problems, that it was simply another example of American quantity attempting to compensate for lack of quality. But what these German pilots and their commanders failed to recognize was that they were seeing the P-38 at its worst, flown by inexperienced pilots using inappropriate tactics at altitudes where the engine struggled, and that profound changes were already underway that would transform the Lightning from a questionable experiment into the most feared American fighter in multiple theaters of war. The transformation began with tactics because unlike the rigid, doctrine-bound Luftwaffe that had been flying essentially the same fighter tactics since the Spanish Civil War, American fighter pilots were encouraged to innovate, to experiment, to find what worked and discard what didn't, and gradually, through hard-won combat experience paid for in blood and burning aircraft scattered across the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Italy, P-38 pilots discovered that their aircraft was never meant to dogfight at all. It was a boom and zoom fighter designed to use its superior speed and climb rate to swoop down from altitude, make a single devastating firing pass with its concentrated nose armament, and then climb back to safety before the enemy could react. And when flown this way, when P-38 pilots stopped trying to turn with powered single-engine fighters, but these early Lightnings also suffered from teething problems that would plague the aircraft throughout its career and provide ammunition for its critics. The Allison engines, designed for low to medium altitude performance, struggled in the thin air above 25,000 feet where the strategic bombing campaign over Europe was being fought. The turbo superchargers that fed those engines had a tendency to fail at the worst possible moments. The cockpit heating system was inadequate for the frigid temperatures at operational altitudes, leaving pilots shivering despite their heavy flight suits and sometimes suffering frostbite on long missions, and most seriously, the aircraft could encounter compressibility problems in high-speed dives, where the thick wings would begin to generate shock waves at speeds approaching the sound barrier, causing the controls to lock up or the aircraft to enter a potentially fatal dive that no amount of pulling on the stick could arrest, phenomena that engineers didn't fully understand and pilots learned about through bitter experience, with some managing to recover by deploying flaps or cutting throttle while others rode their aircraft all the way to the ground. And these problems, combined with the P-38's unfamiliar twin-engine configuration that required different flying techniques and tactical approaches than pilots trained on conventional fighters were accustomed to, led to mixed results in early combat deployments, and skepticism from some quarters about whether the Lightning would ever live up to its promise. The German pilots who first encountered P-38s in combat over North Africa and Sicily in 1942 and early 1943 initially found their skepticism confirmed. Not because the Lightning was inherently inferior, but because the American pilots flying them were often inadequately trained, unfamiliar with the aircraft's optimal fighting tactics, trying to dogfight German fighters in turning battles where the dash intended to showcase the aircraft to Army brass. Lieutenant Ben Kelsey piloted the prototype from California toward New York at speeds that routinely exceeded 400 miles per hour, covering the distance in just over 7 hours with only 2 refueling stops. A feat that would have been remarkable for any aircraft but was absolutely stunning for a fighter, though the demonstration ended in disaster when Kelsey, approaching Mitchell Field for landing with a crowd of generals and dignitaries waiting, discovered his flaps wouldn't extend due to an electrical failure, and attempting to land without flaps at high speed, he overshot the runway and crashed into a golf course, walking away from the wreckage but destroying the only XP-38 in existence. a setback that could have killed the program but instead only delayed it because the performance data gathered during that flight had already proven the concept was sound, that America had designed a fighter that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything else in the sky, and production orders began flowing even as engineers worked to refine the design, strengthen the airframe, improve the engines, and transform Kelly Johnson's radical concept into a combat-ready weapon. The early production P-38s that began reaching operational squadrons in 1941 were magnificent machines by the standards of the day, sleek despite their unconventional layout, bristling with 4.50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon all mounted in the nose where convergence wasn't an issue, powered by twin supercharged Allison engines producing 1,150 horsepower each, capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour at altitude, possessing a combat radius that dwarfed single-engine fighters, equipped with a nose wheel that made ground handling almost car-like compared to the tail-dragging anxiety of conventional fighters, and featuring counter-rotating propellers that eliminated the torque effects that killed so many inexperienced pilots in high, would transform the strategic balance of air power over Europe and ultimately help crush the very squadrons that had laughed at its unusual appearance. The story of the P-38's development began years earlier in 1937, when the United States Army Air Corps issued a specification that seemed almost impossible to fulfill. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, achieving speeds of at least 360 miles per hour, and maintaining that performance for at least 1 hour, requirements that pushed beyond anything currently flying and demanded revolutionary thinking from aircraft designers who were still working primarily with single-engine designs that dated conceptually back to the Great War. And it was Lockheed's brilliant engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson, just 27 years old but already displaying the genius that would later create the State Route 71 Blackbird, who proposed a radical solution. Instead of trying to coax impossible performance from a conventional single-engine airframe, he would build a twin-engine fighter around 2 Allison V-1710 engines, mount them in booms extending back from the wings, place the pilot in a central nacelle between them for optimal visibility and control, arm the nose with concentrated firepower that wouldn't require convergence calculations since all guns fired parallel, and add a tricycle landing gear that was nearly unheard of in fighters but would dramatically improve ground handling and pilot visibility during takeoff and landing, creating an aircraft that looked strange, unconventional, almost ungainly on the ground, but in the air would possess capabilities that would redefine what a fighter could accomplish. When the XP-38 prototype first flew on January 27, 1939, it immediately demonstrated performance that shocked even its creators, and on a transcontinental speed. The arrogance of invincibility is a poison that seeps slowly into the minds of those who've tasted too much victory, and nowhere was this more evident than in the leather-appointed briefing rooms of the Luftwaffe High Command in early 1943, where seasoned German fighter aces gathered around mahogany tables spread with reconnaissance photographs of America's newest fighter, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and laughed with the kind of contemptuous confidence that comes from years of aerial supremacy. Over Europe, their cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling as they mocked the twin-boomed American aircraft that looked more like a mismatched assembly of spare parts than a serious weapon of war, calling it Der Gabelschwanz Teufel with derision rather than fear, translating to the fork-tailed devil, but spoken with the tone reserved for a joke rather than a threat. Because to these veterans who had cut their teeth in Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, who had dominated the skies over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia, who had sent hundreds of Allied bombers spiraling earthward in flames, this ungainly American twin-engine fighter with its tricycle landing gear and bulbous central nacelle appeared to be nothing more than another example of American industrial excess producing quantity over quality, a target-rich environment waiting to be exploited, and they returned to their airfields along the coast of France and the industrial heartland of Germany supremely, confident that when these fork-tailed curiosities appeared in their gun sights, they would fall just as easily as the lumbering B-17s and B-24s they'd been shredding for months. But what these experienced Luftwaffe pilots didn't understand, what they couldn't comprehend from grainy reconnaissance photos and intelligence reports filtered through the lens of their own superiority, was that the P-38 Lightning represented something fundamentally different in aviation warfare, a quantum leap in capability that